For 5 years, they treated me like a guest in my own home. The night they locked me out in the rain, they found out whose house it always was.
The rain had been coming down for an hour when my husband's mother told me to leave her house. And not one of the 3 people standing dry under that portico offered me so much as an umbrella. I stood on the bottom step of the Ashford estate with a single suitcase and the water running cold off the end of my nose. And I looked up at Julian, who would not look back at me, and at the woman beside him in my husband's coat, and Catherine, who had waited 30 years for a reason and had finally decided she didn't need one. Before we go on with Simone's story, if these quiet stories mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Wherever you are, I hope this light finds you warm.
You came into this family with nothing. Simone, she said, not raising her voice, because she never had to. You'll leave the way you came. Whatever you imagine this house owed you, it owes you nothing. Girls like you always confuse a roof with a right to it. Now be sensible. Sign what Julian's lawyer sends over, and there's no need to make this ugly for anyone.
Mother, please. Simone, don't make this a scene. Just take the bag and go. And we'll talk when everyone's had a chance to calm down. It doesn't have to be like this, does it?
Oh, it does. So, Vanessa said from just inside the door, soft, almost bored, wearing my husband's coat like it had always been hers. That's the part she never understood. Julian. People like her think if they smile enough and say sorry enough, the door stays open forever. Good night, say sweetheart. You were always going to end up on the wrong side of it. Gold diggers usually do.
She pulled the door shut on the word. The last thing I saw was the light going out in the front hall of the house I had lived in for 5 years. And then I was alone in the dark, with the rain and a suitcase and a small brass key my father had left me, worn smooth at the bit, that I had carried in my coat lining for a year without ever knowing what had opened. 2 days later, I walked into the private client office of a bank downtown, soaked and shaking, and set that brass key on the desk of a man named Mr. Dwyer. He picked it up, turned it over, ran it against a number in his system, and then he went very still. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. He stood up and closed his office door with the careful quiet of a man who has just realized the person in front of him is not who the world had decided she was.
Mrs. Ashford, he said, do you understand what your father left in your name?
I did not. Not yet. But before you understand how a poor girl in wet clothes made a banker close his door, you have to go back to a father who built half a city and was written out of the story of every building he touched, and a daughter he was determined would never again stand in the rain, begging a locked door to open. If anyone ever made you feel like a guest in a life that was supposed to be yours, stay with me. This story is for you. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what the weather's doing where you are. My name is Simone Ashford, though the name on the deed, it turns out, was always Ellison. For 5 years, I was the daughter-in-law of the Ashfords of Tuxedo Road, one of the oldest Black families in Atlanta, and for 5 years I was reminded, in 100 small and gracious ways, that I did not belong to them and never would. I grew up 2 hours south of the city, in a town most people only know as the exit they don't take. My father, Marcus Ellison was a builder, not a developer with his name on a tower, a builder. The man in the boots who poured the footings and framed the walls and stayed after the crew went home to make sure a thing was plumb and true. He built churches and clinics and other men's fortunes, and he raised me by himself after my mother passed, in a house he'd built with his own hands. And he taught me that a person's worth is in what they leave, standing behind them, not in whose name goes on the sign out front.
There's two kinds of people in this world. Baby girl, he used to tell me, wiping the grit off his hands with a red rag he kept in his back pocket. The kind that measure a person by where they came from, and the kind that measure them by what they build. You'll meet plenty of the first kind, and they'll dress real nice, and they'll make you feel small in rooms you had every right to walk into. Don't you ever shrink to fit their idea of you. You hold still, and you let them find out who they were talking to.
I did not understand, at 19, how much of my life he was preparing me for. I thought it was just the way fathers talk. I met Julian Ashford in my last year of college at a fundraiser I was working, not attending. He was charming in the way that men raised on soft carpets are charming, easy, warm, certain the room would always arrange itself around him. He told me I was the first real thing he'd met in years. I believed him because I wanted to, and because when a beautiful, gilded life opens its door and calls you by name, it takes a stronger girl than I was at 23 to hear the lock underneath the welcome. His mother, Catherine, did not call me by name for the first 6 months. She called me your friend and then your girl, and then, when it became clear I was not going anywhere, she called me Simone, the way you'd handle something you weren't sure was clean.
You must understand our position, dear, she said to me once, early, over a lunch I hadn't wanted, and couldn't refuse. This family has a name. That name is the only thing that has never let us down. We're very careful about what we attach to it. I'm sure your people are lovely, in their way. She set down her fork with the tiny, final click she used instead of a raised voice. But love is a young person's argument. And marriages in this family have always been about more than that. One day you'll thank me for being honest with you now. A girl should know exactly what she's worth to the people she's counting on. It saves so much disappointment later.
My people. My father, at that moment, was 3 counties over on a scaffold in the July heat, finishing a community center he'd underbid on purpose because the town couldn't afford what it was worth. I did not tell her that. I had already learned that the Ashfords did not hear things like that. They heard poor, and their ears closed around the word. We married in the garden of the Tuxedo Road house, and I moved into a family that treated me like a long-term guest who had overstayed a welcome no one could quite remember extending. I want to be fair. It was not all cruelty. Julian, in the early years, was kind more often than not. There was a housekeeper, Odessa, who had run that house for 30 years, and who slipped me plates of real food when Catherine had me on one of her family dinners, where the portions were small enough to make a point. There were mornings the light came through the tall windows, and I let myself believe I had married into something warm. But a family that has decided you don't belong will remind you of it slowly. So slowly you start to think you imagined the last time. It was Catherine deciding the guest list for my own anniversary dinner. It was Julian's cousins asking, every holiday, what it was my father did, and the little silence after I told them, It was my name left off the family foundation letterhead, the joint accounts I somehow never had access to, the way every decision about my own life seemed to get made in a room I wasn't in. And it was Julian, over 5 years, learning from his mother that I was a thing the family had taken in, rather than a woman he had chosen. My father saw it before I would let myself. He came up to the city maybe twice a year. He never liked it. Said the buildings downtown were built to make a man feel like he'd wandered in by mistake, and he'd sit in that big cold living room in his good shirt with his hands folded. And he'd watch. He didn't say much. But on the last visit, the winter before he died, he found me in the kitchen after supper, and he took both my hands in his, and his hands were not as strong as they'd been.
They've got you apologizing for existing in your own home, he said. I've watched you do it all night. You say sorry when somebody bumps into you. When did that start? I didn't have an answer. He nodded like he'd expected that. I built too many houses to not know a foundation that's rotten under a pretty face. Baby, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm going to make sure that whatever you decide is standing on your own 2 feet and not on the edge of somebody else's mercy. You hear me? Never again on somebody's mercy. A house can look finished and be hollow underneath, and you won't know till the weight comes on it, he said, and he held my hands a little tighter. People are the same. Don't you measure these folks by how the front of them is painted. Measure them by what they do the day it costs them something to be decent to you. And whatever you find out, you come home to solid ground. Always. I've made sure of that. You just may not know where it is yet.
I told him I was fine. I was very good, by then, at telling people I was fine. He died that March. Heart, they said. Though I have come to understand it was more than his heart, and had been for 2 years. And that he knew, and that he told no one, least of all me. I flew home and buried him in the town he'd spent his life holding together. And the church was so full, people stood in the road. Men I'd never met told me my father had built the roof over their heads, had carried their family through a hard winter, had done work he never sent a bill for. A woman my age pressed my hand and said, "Your daddy built my whole life and never once let me feel like I owed him for it." The Ashfords sent flowers. Catherine did not come. Julian left after the service. Said he had a meeting. Among my father's things, I found an envelope with my name on it in his blocky carpenter's print. And inside was a single, small brass key and one line on a folded slip of paper. When they make you feel like you have nowhere to go, this opens the place I built for you. Trust the key. Don't trust the name. I turned that key over 100 times. I thought it was a storage unit, a lockbox of old tools, some sentimental thing. Grief makes you set a mystery aside. I sewed it into the lining of my coat so I wouldn't lose it, and I told myself I'd deal with it when I could breathe again. I put it out of my mind for almost a year. That was the year the Ashfords stopped pretending. It started, the way these things do, with money, though I didn't see it as money at the time. Julian grew distant in a new way, not cold so much as absent, a man doing sums behind his eyes. There were closed-door conversations with his mother that stopped when I came in. There was a lawyer at the house twice, a smooth man named Fenwick, and when I asked Julian about it, He said it was just family business, estate, things, nothing you'd follow.
You worry too much, he told me one evening that spring. Not unkindly, already halfway out of the room. Nothing's wrong. Mother just thinks we ought to get our affairs in order, that's all. It's what people at our level do, Simone. You wouldn't. Look, it's just paperwork. Let the lawyers handle the boring part and don't make it into something.
At our level, he had started saying it without hearing it. The way you pick up an accent from the house you've been living in too long. Nothing I'd follow. I had sat at my father's kitchen table doing his invoices since I was 12. But I let it go. Because letting it go was the skill I'd been perfecting for 5 years. Then Odessa, the housekeeper, caught my arm in the pantry one afternoon, with her jaw set the way you set your jaw before you do something that could cost you.
"I've kept this house 30 years, and I've kept my mouth shut for every one of them," she said, low and fast. "I'm not going to keep it shut for this. There's papers, Miss Simone, in Mr. Julian's study, in the top drawer. Papers with your name on them and a signature that isn't yours. I've watched a lot of things happen in this family that weren't right. I won't watch this one happen to the one person in it who ever treated me like a person. I raised 3 children in the back rooms of this house, and I know the sound of people planning something in a room they think is empty," she went on, tightening her grip on my arm. "You didn't marry into a family, baby. You married into a firm, and they've been holding a quiet little board meeting about you since the day you walked in that door. Now you listen to me. Get yourself a lawyer of your own before they find out you know how to spell the word. Don't you let them see your face change. Not tonight."
I did not want to believe her. I want you to understand that because I think a lot of you know exactly what I mean. It is easier, so much easier, to believe you are imagining it than to believe the people you married into are actually doing the thing your whole body is telling you they're doing. I went into the study that night after Julian was asleep. I told myself I was just gonna look, just to put my mind at rest, just to prove Odessa wrong. The top drawer was locked, but I had spent a childhood around a man who could open anything, and I got it. Inside was a folder, and inside the folder was my life, rearranged by other hands. Divorce papers, drafted, dated 3 weeks out. A financial disclosure that listed my contribution to the marriage as nil. A prenuptial agreement I had never in my life seen, dated the week before my wedding, with my signature at the bottom, except it wasn't my signature. I make my S with a straight back. Whoever forged it had given it a curl I've never used. And a letter from Fenwick's firm to Catherine, laying out, in clean numbered paragraphs, how to establish that I had entered the marriage in bad faith, how to protect the family assets, how to make sure that when they put me out, I would go with exactly what I came in with. Nothing. There was a phrase in Catherine's own hand in the margin, next to a line about my expectations. She had written, "She'll sign. She has nowhere to go." I sat on the floor of that study for a long time. I was not crying. Something colder than crying had come over me. Because it was not a fight. It was not a marriage going bad. It was a plan, drawn up by professionals, discussed over the dinners I'd been apologizing my way through, executed by people who had shaken my father's hand at my wedding. And the whole thing turned on one belief they all shared so completely they'd written it in the margin, that I had nowhere to go. I thought of the key sewn into my coat. I did not confront them. Everything in me wanted to walk into Catherine's bedroom and throw that folder on her bed. But my father's daughter knew better. And Odessa's warning was still in my ears. People who have drawn up a plan on paper are dangerous when they know you've seen it. So I did what I had never once done in that house. I got ahead of them. The next morning, I called the number on the slip that had been folded around the key. My father, it turned out, had written more than one line, and on the back was a name and a number I'd missed in my grief. The name was Adrienne Cole, attorney. I thought she'd be a stranger. When I gave my name, there was a pause on the line, and then a warmth I wasn't ready for.
Simone Ellison, she said. I have been waiting a long time for you to call. Your father set this up with me almost 2 years ago and made me promise I'd never reach out to you first. He said you had to come to it on your own 2 feet, or it wouldn't do what he built it to do. I've got a file here with your name on it that I think is going to change the way you understand the last 5 years of your life. How soon can you come see me?
I went that afternoon, and what Adrienne Cole told me, across a conference table stacked with folders my father had assembled in the last 2 years of his life, I could not hold all at once.
Here's what you can't see yet, because you've spent 5 years being told you have no standing, she said, spreading the ledgers out between us. That forged prenuptial agreement in Julian's study isn't your weakness. It's theirs. It is a felony, with Catherine's own handwriting in the margin of it. The moment we prove that signature isn't yours, you stop being the woman they're quietly divorcing, and you become the woman they defrauded. And those are 2 very different women in the eyes of a court. But before I say another word, I want you to go see something with your own eyes. Because you're not going to believe the rest of it from me. You have to believe it from the vault.
So she did the wise thing. She sent me to the bank first, to see it for myself, before she explained how it came to be. That is how I came to be standing at Mr. Dwyer's desk with the brass key, 2 days after Catherine Ashford put me out in the rain, because I had not gone back to that house after the study. I had checked into a small hotel on the south side, the kind of place nobody looks for you. And I had sat with what I knew for 1 full day before I let them think they'd won by staging the eviction they'd planned on paper. They put me out believing I had nowhere to go. They were the last people in the state to find out otherwise. Mr. Dwyer ran the key against his system and closed his office door and asked me if I understood what my father had left in my name.
This key opens a safe deposit box held under a holding company called Red Rag Holdings, he said, and I almost laughed, because a red rag was the thing my father wiped his hands with every day of his life. You are the sole beneficiary. But the box is only part of it. Red Rag is the entity of record on 2 assets I need you to look at carefully, because I want to be certain you're hearing me. He turned his monitor toward me, the way you'd turn a mirror towards someone so they'll finally see their own face.
The first was a deed. A residential property on Tuxedo Road. The Ashford estate. The house I had lived in for 5 years. The house whose front door had just been locked against me in the rain. It was not owned by the Ashfords. It had not been owned by the Ashfords for almost 2 years. It was owned, free and clear, by Red Rag Holdings. By me. The second was a certificate of shares. Ashford Group, the family real estate company. Julian's birthright, the empire, whose name was the only thing Catherine said had never let her down, was a company in which Red Rag Holdings held a controlling stake. 52%. My father had bought control of the Ashfords' own company and the roof over their heads, and left both to the girl they called a gold digger, and none of them had the first idea. I asked Mr. Dwyer the only thing I could think to say. I asked him what it was worth. He was quiet a moment, the way a decent man is quiet before he tells you something enormous.
The deed and the controlling interest together, he said. On the conservative side, north of $40 million. But Mrs. Ashford, Ms. Ellison, the number isn't the part I'd want you to walk out of here thinking about. Your father didn't leave you money. Any man with money can leave money. Your father left you the ground the people who threw you out are standing on. There's a difference. He built you a floor.
Everything my father had ever said to me came back at once, and I understood, finally, in a banker's quiet office, that he had not been talking. He had been building. For 2 years, dying and telling no one. He had been laying a foundation under a daughter he could see was about to fall. Inside the safe deposit box was a letter, and I will come to the letter, because it is the truest thing in this whole story, and it is not what you think. But first I have to tell you what I did with the floor he built me, because the doing of it is the part 1. Hope you'll carry out of here. I did not call Julian. I did not call Catherine. I called Adrienne Cole, and I asked her one question. What do the papers in that study let them do to me? And what does the deed and the shares let me do back? She told me the truth, which is that their forged prenup and their bad faith filing were not just weak. They were crimes, forgery, fraud, an attempt to strip a spouse through falsified documents, and at the moment I could prove the signature wasn't mine. Their whole plan became the most dangerous thing in the room for them, not for me. And she told me that as the controlling shareholder of Ashford Group and the owner of the estate, I did not have to ask anyone in that family for anything ever again. I could simply act, and they could find out afterward, the way I always had. But Adrienne, who had been my father's friend, as well as his lawyer, told me one more thing, and it was the thing that decided how I did all of it.
Your daddy was the least vengeful man I ever met, she said. He could have crushed these people quietly any day of the last 2 years and never told you. He didn't. He left it to you because he wanted you to have the choice he never had to walk into the room that shut you out and decide, standing on your own ground, who you want to be, not who they made you. You've got more power than they can imagine right now, Simone. The only question your father cared about is what kind of woman you'll be while you hold it.
I sat with that for 3 days. And then I went back to Tuxedo Road. I did not go back begging, and I did not go back to burn it down. I let Adrienne file first, a full accounting, the forged documents flagged to the court, a motion that froze the Ashfords, access to the company accounts pending review, because a controlling shareholder is allowed to ask why the family had been quietly bleeding a failing company dry. That last part was the piece I hadn't understood until Adrienne walked me through the books. Ashford Group had been insolvent for years. The name Catherine trusted above all things had been hollow for a decade. The grand life on Tuxedo Road had been running on debt and appearances, and the reason they needed me gone with nothing was not greed alone. It was that there was almost nothing left, and they could not afford to split even the wreckage. The family called an emergency meeting the moment the accounts froze. Fenwick's firm, Catherine, Julian, and a stranger from the bank they didn't yet know worked for me. They gathered in the boardroom of Ashford Group under the portraits of 3 generations of Ashford men. And they did not know, when they sat down, that the building they were sitting in answered to me. I walked in 10 minutes late, on purpose, because I had learned the value of letting people fill a silence with their own certainty before you correct it. I wore a plain dark suit. I did not raise my voice. I have had, as I said, a great deal of practice at letting people finish. Catherine started in before I'd sat down.
You have some nerve. Whatever grubby little lawyer you've found, whatever you think you're doing, freezing this family's accounts, you have no standing here. Simone, you never did. You are a guest who forgot she was a guest.
I let her finish. Then I nodded to Adrienne, who slid a single folder down the length of that long table, and I watched Fenwick open it, and I watched the color leave a professional man's face for the second time in a week. Because inside were the deed to the house, the share certificate, and the forged prenuptial agreement side by side with a sample of my actual signature. Fenwick read for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he leaned over and murmured something in Catherine's ear. And Catherine Ashford, who had never in 30 years let her face show a thing she didn't choose, went as still as Mr. Dwyer had gone in his office. She understood before anyone else in the room. She always was the sharpest of them.
Catherine, he said, low, but the room was silent enough to carry it. Say nothing else. Not one word. The controlling interest in this company is held by an entity called Red Rag Holdings. And the beneficiary of Red Rag Holdings is, he looked up the table at me. And for the first time in 5 years, a member of that family's inner circle looked at me and actually saw me, is sitting at the end of the table. She owns the house. She owns this company. And there is a forged legal instrument on the table with your marginal notes on the copy in your own handwriting.
That is not possible. For the first time in 30 years, I heard the name fail her in her own mouth. This company is Ashford. It has always been Ashford. Some builder's daughter does not simply walk in and she stopped because she had heard herself say builder, and because she was, whatever else she was, far too intelligent not to have already done the arithmetic. Where, she said, very quietly, would a girl like that get $40 million?
Mom. His voice broke on the single syllable. Mom, stop talking. Please, just stop. Don't you understand what he's telling you? It's over. It's been over for 2 years. We didn't know whose house we were living in.
I want to tell you that Julian did something more in that moment. That he stood up for me, or against me, that he was anything at all. He put his head in his hands. That was the truest thing my husband ever did in front of me. Nothing. With his face hidden, while his mother's world came apart and his wife held the pieces. Vanessa was not there. She had already gone. Women like Vanessa can feel a fortune go hollow before the men do. I did not gloat. I found, when the moment finally came that I had no appetite for it at all, I stood up at my end of the table, and I spoke quietly, and I said the only thing I'd come to say. For 5 years, I told them, every one of you made me feel like I was standing in a house on your goodwill. Like the floor under my feet was a favor you could take back whenever I forgot my place. I put my hand flat on the table. I want you to understand something, because my father would want me to say it plain. The floor was never yours. It was his. He poured it, and he left it to me, and he did it because he could see, before I could, exactly what you were. You didn't take me in. I was holding you up the whole time, and none of you ever once looked down to see whose ground you were standing on. Catherine did not answer. There was, for once, nothing in the name to reach for. What happened after is less of a courtroom drama than you might want, and I've made my peace with that. Adrienne's firm and mine, I had a firm now, did not have to fight. Because there was nothing to fight with. The forged prenup collapsed the divorce filing and put Catherine and Fenwick under a criminal referral for fraud that is, as I speak to you, still working its slow way through a system that is not kind to people who forge a spouse's name to steal from her. Fenwick lost his license. Catherine's world, the one built on a name, discovered that a name is worth exactly what the ledger behind it says, and the ledger said nothing. I did not put her out in the rain. I thought about it. I stood in the front hall of that house one afternoon, the house that was mine now, and I imagined locking the door on Catherine Ashford, with the weather coming, giving her back the exact night she'd given me. And then I found I didn't want to be a woman who had learned cruelty from the people who taught it to me. My father hadn't built me a floor so I could push someone off it. I gave them 90 days. I let Odessa keep her position, at a wage that made her sit down when I told her. And I sold the Tuxedo Road house, because a house is only walls, and those walls had never once been a home to me. Now here is the letter. I told you it was the truest thing in this story, and that it wasn't what you think, and I need you to hear it the way I finally did, standing in that bank vault with my father's handwriting in my shaking hands. Because until I read it, I believed my father had done all of this for revenge. I believed the Ashfords must have wronged him, and this was his long, patient reckoning. And there was a wrong, I learned it in the letter, a real one. From 30 years back, Marcus Ellison had been the builder on the first 3 developments that made the Ashford fortune. Back when Catherine's late husband, Gerald, was starting out. My father did the work, and Gerald Ashford took the credit, and a great deal more than the credit. There had been a partnership promised and a partnership denied. A young black builder's name quietly scrubbed off the projects he'd raised out of red Georgia clay, so that an older black family with a better name could put theirs on. My father had been erased from the story of the very buildings that made the people who would one day look down on his daughter. So I opened that letter certain it would be a settling of scores. And this is what it said. I am going to read you the part 1 have read every night since.
Baby girl, if you're reading this, then it happened the way I was afraid it would, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there to stand between you and it. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking your daddy did all this to get back at those people for what Gerald Ashford did to me a long time ago. I need you to hear me, because it's the most important thing I ever built. This was never about them. When I found out that company was failing, I didn't buy it to take it from them. I bought it because it was the one thing on God's earth those people believed made them better than you. And I could not stand the thought of you spending your life being made small by a thing that was already hollow. I didn't build you a weapon, Simone. I built you a floor, so that on the worst night of your life, when the door was locked and the rain was coming down, you would find out you were never standing on their mercy. You were standing on your Father's work, and your Father's work has never once given way. Don't spend this hating them. Hating them is just another way of letting them decide who you are. Build something. That's all I ever knew how to do, and it's the only thing that ever lasted. Build something, and put my red rag in your pocket, and let them find out who they were talking to.
I have built something. It took 2 years, and it is not finished, and it never will be, which my father would have said is the whole point. I kept Ashford Group, and I gave it a new name and an old purpose. It builds now what my father built, clinics and community centers and housing that ordinary people can actually afford. In the towns, the big developers take the exit past. And I started a fund with Adrian on the board called the Red Rag Fund for women who find themselves exactly where I was, married into a life that decided they were guests in it, standing at a locked door on a bad night, certain they have nowhere to go. We give them a lawyer before they need one. We give them the thing my father gave me, which is a floor to stand on while they decide who they want to be. We have helped 41 women at the last count. Not one of them signed the paper they were handed. Not one of them went out with nothing. Julian wrote to me after 3 letters over a year. The first one asked for money, in the careful language of a man who has never had to ask for anything. I did not answer it. The second one, months later, was different. It didn't ask for anything. And it said that he had spent his whole life believing the name would hold him up, and that watching it go hollow had shown him he'd never once stood on his own feet, and that he was sorry, most of all, that he had learned to see me the way his mother did, and had called it love. I read that one twice. The third one, a year on, only said that he'd taken a job, a real one, with his own hands, framing houses for a builder outside Savannah, and that for the first time in his life, he understood something about my father. He wished he'd asked me when he had the chance. I wrote him back one line. I said, "Then you finally met him. He'd have liked you better this way." I don't know if there's a road back with Julian. I've stopped needing there to be. Forgiveness and trust are different things. My father used to say, you can hand a man the first without ever owing him the second, and I have handed Julian the first, because carrying the other thing was too heavy, and I have too much building left to do. Sometimes in the evening, I stand in the little house I built for myself now. Nothing grand. 1 story. Good bones. A porch that faces west, so I get the last of the light. And I think about that night on the bottom step of Tuxedo Road, the suitcase, the rain, the door going dark, the 3 of them certain I had nowhere on this earth to go. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about it from the very first day, and so was I. And the difference between us is that I found out. I was never standing on their goodwill. I was standing, the whole time, On ground, a man in muddy boots had poured under me while nobody was looking, out of love, so that on the worst night of my life, it would hold. If you take one thing from an old builder's daughter tonight, let it be this. Somebody is going to try to convince you that the floor under your feet is a favor they can take back, that you are a guest in your own life. Do not believe them. You do not know yet everything that has been built under you by the people who loved you when it cost them something. You do not know your own ground. And it is never, ever too late to stop apologizing for standing on it. So tell me, have you ever been made to feel like a guest in a place that should have been yours? Where are you watching from tonight? And what's the weather doing?